morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you all again. First, before we start, thank you all for again voting for my session, and thank you for DynamicsCon for organizing, such a great conference again where we can actually all share our knowledge. I'm actually really happy to be here again, and let's get started. So, what I have for you today is effectively a presentation about what I wanted to cover is best practices to manage Dynamics 365 requirements in Azure DevOps. My name is Dani Kahil. I specialize in mastering requirements and solution envisioning. Kind of my official role is solution specialist / solution architect on Dynamics 365 projects. I work as an independent consultant, so I kind of help other partners or end clients implement Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform and really take advantage of really those great tools and get together to a shared understanding of requirements, right? So in this session today, really, I thought to focus about a specific tool called Azure DevOps and how I use that tool, to manage requirements. So before we really start into the content, so I know you guys can interact with me in the chat. So really don't hesitate to, as we go, as I present, ask your question, because I'm responding live to your question at the same time. So whenever you have a question, don't hesitate to, interact, and then I'll responding as we go through the presentation. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll be live again responding to any kind of other questions that I couldn't respond to the chat. So don't hesitate again to be very, very interactive during the presentation. So before we start with the content, a little bit of intro about myself, where I come from. So look, I live in Australia on the Gold Coast. So it's just south of Brisbane, beautiful city at the sea. So hopefully when, all the restrictions are over or kind of and the country is reopening again, I would really sincerely encourage you, if you visit Australia, go take a look on the Gold Coast. Amazing city. There is also 30 minutes inland, some beautiful walks, beautiful rainforest tracks. So really great to see. Also, I want to share with you, I'm a big fan of Body Attack. I love sports. And again, if you are into cardio and kind of sport conditioning, this is a great, sport I recommend you try. And last but not least, I love colors. So I'm a big fan of diagrams, very colorful diagrams and very colorful shirts as well. I had to wear something a little bit more subtle for this presentation here because of the recording and so forth, but I love really wearing colorful shirt from time to time. So that's really about me. Now let's get a bit more into the content. So what I prepared really for you today was about Azure DevOps, right? So I will cover what are Azure DevOps boards, and then we'll go a bit more into the details, for each of those topics. What is structuring requirements in Azure DevOps board? What is capturing requirements? And then how do we manage those requirements in Azure DevOps boards, right? So I'll cover each of those topics with a few stories and kind of demos of how we're going to do that. And again, if you have any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to ask them in the chat, and I'm happy to, again, respond live to those questions. So without further ado, let's start. So the punchline really I wanted to give you is there is no one way for managing requirements in DevOps. Each client is different. Each project is different. Each client have a different understanding of how to manage requirements. They have different culture, different level of knowledge as well. So you will have to kind of pick and choose for your clients based on what they need. And what I mean with that is, I'll be sharing a few of my tips in the presentation today, but for some clients, you can use all of them, right? If you go a little bit too advanced with clients that don't know Azure DevOps at all, that don't understand how to manage requirements in an agile project, they will probably struggle if you go full on from day one. You kind of need to pick and choose. So again, right, those are great tips, but you will have to find your source and adapt it to your specific project. Excel to manage requirements? So question mark. So again, I wanted to share with you a story that happened to me a few years ago, where I started working with a client, and effectively we really started kind of going through Excel spreadsheet, and look, it's very common still that we see requirements being formulated in Excel spreadsheet. And I mean, it's quite often, especially at the beginning of the project, this is how, when a clients want to interact with a partner, the requirements are shared in Excel spreadsheet. But I wouldn't recommend that you use that Excel spreadsheet to manage the requirements going forward, right? But it still happened, right? So what happened to me a few years ago, so I was starting a new project in Sydney. I remember entering, in Sydney has some beautiful views. Some of the high scraper in the city, have some amazing views. So I was entering that office from a new client. I met with the product owner. Let's call it Katie here. I don't want to reveal her real name, but so I enter in this meeting room with Katie. She was the product owner for that new project where I was starting. And then we kind of have a bit of a chit chat waiting for her BA to join us. And, the goal was really to go through their requirements and, see how far Dynamics would be able to fit and fulfill their requirements. So it was kind of a more discovery session, discussing with them how to kind of deliver their requirements. So I remember Katie, so we waited for the BA came in, and Katie opened an Excel spreadsheet. And the first thing was that spreadsheet kind of took seconds. It's very long seconds to open, and even freezed the first time she tried to open the spreadsheet, right? And Katie kind of said, it kind of happens lately. It happens all the time. Because the more people add to that spreadsheet, the more they kind of, comment in it. Also, that spreadsheet was connected to some kind of background queries and so forth. So, she closed it, then reopened it again. And then that spreadsheet effectively, look, I found an example online to kind of try to reflect what it looked like, just to not reveal the real one, but it was way bigger than that. Way more rows, way more columns and colors, a bit all over the place with comments. And, we went through 3 hours of reviewing this. The filtering was difficult because they had duplicates, values in columns and so forth. And, after 3 long hours, the requirements were okay, actually, right? Nothing kind of, the requirements were nicely written and everything, but just the formatting and managing that in an Excel spreadsheet, kind of scared me a bit. So at the end of that session with them, I said to Katie, look, Katie, we usually use another tool to manage requirements called Azure DevOps. Do you mind if I show you? And if we start working together, maybe we can look at transitioning from managing your requirements in that spreadsheet into that tool. And seeing the pain they have to manage that in Excel spreadsheet, they were very keen to see how that could be done in a different and kind of / better way. So I kind of spend the time showing them, and it's a bit what I will be showing you today here. I spend the time kind of showing them how to do that in DevOps, and we delivered the project using Azure DevOps, and they were very happy with it, and they continue to using it now. So let me walk you through now to how my best practices on how to manage requirements in Azure DevOps. So what is Azure DevOps? So first thing I want to do is I will show you effectively Azure DevOps in live. So what I will do now is I'll go to a web browser. So Azure DevOps is effectively a web application. You can subscribe to it from Azure. And then this is effectively how it looks like when you start a new project. So you can effectively go to your kind of Azure DevOps environment, and you can select the project that you want to work with. And if you go into the board, because this is what I wanted to show you, the backlog, sorry. If I click on backlog, the backlog is effectively a list of requirements, a list of items where people can so you can structure those requirements. People can write more details requirements in them. They can manage. They can collaborate. We can see the values. I mean, it's kind of whatever was in that Excel spreadsheet, you can kind of put it in here and have a system to help you manage it, right? So if you see here my epic, so those are the high level kind of requirements, and I'll walk you through the structure of how I structure the requirements in the next few slides. As I can see, you can start with an epic, and then if you drill down, you go to the feature level, and then you get drilled down to the user story level. And if I even pick another epic here, I can go to, let me go to inquiry management, go to case management as my feature, and I have, my different user stories, and then we can see the state. And if I pick this one, I can even go to the task and the bug. So it's a nice way to kind of structure and organize your requirements, and also to manage them along the way, right? So if I collapse again everything, I can also use that button here to open everything up, right? Really open all the backlog, and very easily, I can add requirements from here. So if I'm at the epic level, if I click on that button, that will add a feature. If I'm at the feature level, if I click on that button, that will effectively add a story, and I can fill in my story here. And how I structure really my requirements is, epic at the high level, feature, at the second layer, which is, so the epic, kind of the big business initiative. The epic is the big business initiative. The feature, it's more the Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform kind of feature available that you can use to deliver on very specific requirements. So your requirements under a feature, how I structure it, is kind of every single line of requirements is describing a user story, is effectively written down under a feature that is related more into, as I said, the Dynamics 365 or Power Platform feature, which fits an epic, right? All right, let's go back quickly to the slide deck from here. So what I will do now is continue. So I showed you, the live demo. I covered briefly before, how I have my epic, feature, user stories, and task even. So as I said, high level business initiative for, the epic. The feature is kind of the group of features against Dynamics or the Power Platform to deliver that epic. The user story is an informal natural language description of a single line of requirements, and then you have tasks even underneath. Even you can create bugs as well. But here, how I structure my requirements, the task would be to a configuration or an analysis task to perform, to deliver the user story, right? All right, let's continue on the presentation. So structuring requirements, really, there are kind of two entries to this. There is, you can also start with no requirements. It happens if you start a new project and there is no requirements at all. That could be an entry point as well. And I have a few slides to cover this entry point. But there is also a way where, as I described in my story, you get the list of requirements. So again, if you get a list of requirements, the approach is slightly different. You'll have to kind of structure the requirements you get to fit within Azure DevOps, right? So if you go with the no requirements approach, is what I often use is kind of, I describe the high level business processes that I need to meet as part of Dynamics. So in this example, it could be, an inquiry management system for university, or it's oriented for university here, where you have the business processes is, student self-service, inquiry submission, communication about the inquiry, and so forth. So those are kind of your big high level business initiatives that needs to be covered. And then effectively, what you do is kind of you decompose each one of those big items, those big process flows, steps in the process flows into, why do you want to why do you want to even care about that, which helps you kind of fine tune even those business initiatives to make sure that they are, the priority, and make sure that they are aligned with the goal of your company and so forth. And how do you meet them? So again, the how here, how do we deliver student self-service, different kind of technology, or even business initiative as well. You can have a portal, you can have FAQ database, you can have virtual agent and so forth. So I won't cover more because that's really another subject, and I have a few articles in my website about those techniques. But once you have identified and help your client define their requirements or their high level requirements to start with, you can start lining them up, in Azure DevOps, where if I take the business initiative here, that would be on my epic. Then if I take, all the features under that epic, that's effectively my feature. So in still here, portal with knowledge article, it's my student portal. And then I can build on, my user stories underneath. If you have existing requirements, again, you maybe start from an Excel spreadsheet. What you do is you will have to kind of do a little bit of a mapping where maybe you start the categorization or that the client used. That will be your epic. Then you have, your group of user stories go into a feature. So every single line of user story is often being delivered by a feature in Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform. I try to group them so that I can work at the same time on all those stories, just for productivity's reason, right? You can group them together, and then you have your individual stories that are formed, and you can create them underneath. So that was about structuring requirements. So again, if you have any questions, please answer them even now, because I can straight away respond them to the chat, or I'll respond in a few minutes after the presentation live to all the questions you have about, structuring requirements. Now, capturing requirements, once you kind of have an idea of how you structure requirements, you want to capture them, right? So, or you start capturing your requirements and then you structure them along the way. But it's often a good idea to kind of know a little bit how you're going to structure your requirements first. So before going to really how to capture and what I do with capturing, requirement ownership is a super important aspect of it, where and sometimes I see clients struggling with that, especially if Dynamics 365 and implementing IT systems is new to them, or the product owner. They don't really understand what does that mean or how to work with requirements. But really key is requirements needs to be owned by your client and your product owner. There is a product owner that is, delivering some business values out of Dynamics, right? And those requirements need to be owned really by a product owner. So it doesn't mean that the product owner needs to do everything in Azure DevOps, right? Often I'm helping, or there is a BA helping write up the requirements, but they need to make the key decisions. They need to kind of approve or reject some requirements. They need to validate, the acceptance criteria and so forth. Requirement origin, just a quick kind of where do we start with capturing requirements? So it's kind of different, again, source or origins for requirements. So if you start a new project, what I covered, right? You get a list of requirements, maybe from a client, or you help the client define requirements. I covered those two scenarios in the slides before. For in-flight projects, so even if you start a new project and you work on a project, new requirements will come up along the way, right? When you workshop, when you have conversation, new ideas will come and form, and your clients will come up with some additional ideas, improvement, and new requirements. Demo showcases, same. You show something to the client and suddenly they sparks an idea to them for maybe a new requirements or change to a requirement that they had that you have to manage, right? And again, operation, once you go live, new ideas or improvements will kind of form and we will be submitted by, your users. So a user story, right? So I capture, so if you remember in the hierarchies that where I had epics, feature, user stories, and tasks. So I really use user stories to capture kind of the details of my requirements. Or, I mean, when I'm saying I use as a team. We use it's again something that really the product owner and the client should own, the client implementing Dynamics, but we use user story to capture really the details of the requirements. And it's very important. Look, it's not a session really about how to write user stories and so forth. There are plenty of other sessions and courses about that, but really very important that when you capture user stories, you focus on the what and the why. So what does the system need to do and why, and not the how, right? So try to avoid describing user stories and writing how does the system need to deliver something. Focus on the what does the system need to do and why. That's kind of the key, my key take on user stories. So when you start creating user stories in Azure DevOps, the fields that I most often use, and I'll walk you through this, is the title, which is a short title of the requirements. I have my state, and I'll cover the states of the requirements in a few slides below. So the requirements go through different states. I have my description that I use to, write the requirements in a format of, as a role, I want two actions so that benefits. We try to use its syntax because it kind of forces always to identify the user, identify the what, and identify the why. So it's kind of helpful in writing stories. Documents. So there's different way you can store documents in Azure DevOps. You can store documents in that attachment tab here. I don't like using that one a lot, because once you attach a document, you cannot really edit it. You have to download the document again, re-upload a new version. While sometimes, rules in Excel spreadsheet or kind of mapping documents need to be worked on along the way, and downloading, re-uploading is, I don't find very it has benefits because you have a snapshot of that document at the current time. That's definitely a benefit. But in an agile way, I often capture my kind of mapping, kind of more detailed, rules for a requirement in a SharePoint folder or a team SharePoint folder, and I reference that folder here. Acceptance criteria, where it's again to confirm a shared understanding of requirements and agreement on how we're going to deliver the requirements. Look, I try not to I advise my clients not to go over kind of 10 bullet points and a few rules there. If it's way more complex, use an Excel spreadsheet to define those rules in there. Tags. So I have a few slides also about tags a bit down the track, but I use tags as well to manage, my requirements. So I use, for example, in review here. It helps you categorize again. It's kind of a bit more looser, categorize and filter requirements. Story points. So to estimate the amount of work required to complete the user story is quite handy, especially when you start planning before your at the sprint planning, how much looking at the capacity, how much user stories you can kind of fit. Also, story point is kind of a nice way as a team to kind of get a shared understanding of how complex is that story, right? Where if you vote a bit together on, try to understand what is the vote of each member, then effectively it kind of helps you make sure that everyone kind of has the same kind of understanding about the complexity of the story. So it's a good exercise also for that. Priority. So the business priority to help you and the business focus on key requirements. And related, where you can see the parent feature, you can relate it, you can see the child stories, you can see the related stories, you can see the child task. So here it's important when you start using the discussion as well here, and you start tagging other stories, they will appear here as well. And then that's what I was mentioning. The discussion is used to kind of if you want to discuss things and flag things about the user story, you can start discussing the requirement here. Look, if it's really rules or acceptance criteria, don't define some specific acceptance criteria here. Use that field for this. Is more kind of an open way where you can kind of communicate with other members and track the conversation, and also relate other stories, maybe, right? They can be tracked in here. Managing requirements. So once you have captured the requirements in Azure DevOps, so we know the structure, we know how to capture them and where to capture them. Managing them is also quite important. Where I'll walk you through the requirements lifecycle, and then I will show you in Azure DevOps how does that look like. The boards, where you can see the requirements board, you can see the sprint board as well in there. So managing requirements, if you remember this slide where that's the origin of your requirements. Effectively, when I start, or when we start, your user store will look kind of simple, right? When a new ID comes up, I often just use the title and the state is kind of new and maybe the priority, and that's it, right? Because you don't want to spend too much time detailing that requirements from the very beginning if that's a low priority, if maybe the business doesn't want it. So your product owner needs to be quite involved in there. So new user story can be logged in like that. Then effectively what's happening, there are a few discussions, conversation happening. And effectively what's happening, your story evolves, right? Where you start adding way more content to it. So throughout the conversation, it's almost like a loop. We have conversations, we have meetings, so I try myself to demo Dynamics 365 features, out of the box feature. If it doesn't exactly meet, and often it doesn't exactly meet what the client want, I prototype a bit. Now it's super easy to prototype things in the Power Platform, add new fields, play a bit with the forms. You don't have to build the whole story. That's not the point, but give an idea of how that could work. And I kind of play with fields, form, and so forth using that prototype. And in that round, you effectively add, the description. As you go through the conversation, you formulate your story, you kind of populate your documents, you add your acceptance criteria that will be updated, you play with the tags, you add maybe related work, right? Maybe you pick, as you go from the conversation, maybe you pick some additional related user stories that you need to expand on, right, or create. So I use that in there, and of course the discussion along the way is captured. And so I said about the stages. So this is really the new stage I often use. So when I create just an idea, right? Just an idea comes up, or during a workshop, someone has an idea. Oh, that might be handy. Let's explore if that's really something that we could use. Let's create what we do. Let's quickly create a new requirement in the state new. And then we have a conversation later on if we need to progress that item or to analysis or not, or maybe it's not important. Maybe put in the backlog for next year, or whatever, right? So once you progress into that, it goes to analysis. And then once we kind of get a bit of a shared understanding of what we want to do, so acceptance criteria are defined, maybe I did a prototype or two, we had a few conversations, we can move that story into dev. So what happened then is when you move that story into dev, you're going to, when you start really the dev, you kind of want to add the story point to be able to see how complex is that story for your dev team to be able to build it. So you create tasks for your dev team and maybe some test cases already. Once your story is in dev, you can kind of continue on populating and updating that story. I left here conversation, demo, and prototype because that going from analysis to design doesn't really stop that, right? It's a conversation keeps on happening. I want to keep on showing dev progress to my team. I want to demo them how I progress on things. Maybe even look, the acceptance criteria might just give us most kind of the big rules. We understand what we want to build, but there are some fine details maybe that even in the dev we can kind of still fine tune and tweak using a prototype, right? Where the story is built 50%, but maybe just a little bit of is left off and needs a bit of prototyping so that we can continue and finish that story. So this is why I left it there. It's definitely more during the analysis where this is kind of happening. Later it's more kind of dev showcases and presentation and just getting feedback from the user on how it's tracking, right? So the stages, to continue on the stages, because we're missing a few, right? So I often use new in analysis, in dev. I also have, of course, the other states that I often use of a user story, in test, in UAT, and then done, where effectively, as you go through those stages, of course, your state changes, but also documents maybe are being kind of changed or updated. Discussions are being added, related work, maybe new tasks or new stories might be picked up, right, during tests, or during UAT. Um, we avoid really changing the description and the acceptance criteria once it's in dev or in test, because it's kind of, you should, if that happens, look, we should probably create another user stories in that space. It's not really a black and white always, but that's definitely one of my recommendations. Leave the user stories and the acceptance criteria, how they were defined in the analysis, and and the tags, of course, right? So I still use the tags in there because they kind of change. And and you kind of take off your task, your cases as you go through all those stages. Tags, they help me as well, kind of manage as well requirements where I have some general tags that I use like to review. So whatever the state, I can use this tag to say, I want to review that user stories with my product owner or my team, because I have some questions I want to ask. And I will show you how we can use colors in Azure DevOps to nicely show tags and make them kind of more relevant when you see a board, when you want to discuss things with your product owners. I often use to demo when I'm done with a prototype, I'm done with kind of, or I really want to demo things. I use that tag often. Peer review. So this is product owner review. It's when you want to tag a story that now it's with the product owner to review, maybe just product owner, take a look at the acceptance criteria. Are you okay? Let's progress it to dev. Or, a story has been passed testing or passed UAT. Product owners, please validate and accept that user story so that it can be, delivered and closed. We also use blocked. If a user story is, maybe there is I don't know, it's dependent on a technical solution or technical software being installed, and we cannot progress on this one. Or maybe, it's way more complex than we anticipated, and we need, there is maybe a contractual discussion, whatever. We can use the blocked tag for that. I also use some tags specific sometimes for related to some of the stages. So in design, when I do, when a story is in analysis, when I kind of understand most of it and I just want to fine tune the design before I can progress it to dev, I mark it in design. In dev, when it's finished, we use the ready to test. In test, then it's ready for UAT, and in UAT ready for prod. You can use also fields for that. I often use tags because it's kind of easy. You can add them in, color them nicely, and so forth. So those are really kind of my best practices for tags. Now, for the end, let me show you how this whole thing looked like in Azure DevOps. So I'll show you a live demo of Azure DevOps, because using the stages that I showed you and the tags and the tags, you can actually nicely color some of those user stories, colors the tags, and it kind of helps you manage that in Azure DevOps. So let me switch now to Azure DevOps and go first. I'll show you first the board. So this is the backlog, but the board really shows you, for example, all your user stories that you have, and you can filter them as well. But you can see your story, in stages. So stage new, in analysis that I covered, in dev, in test, you can go on, right? All your stages are there, and you can kind of drag and drop your story when they're ready. You can move them on. You can add some rules as well in some user story. You can say, in DevOps, you could say that the story cannot move to, in dev if there are no acceptance criteria, right? You can add specific rules to that story. As you can see, you have all your nice tags here. So blocked, what I can do is here, I can say that the tag is red, but I can also say, color the tile in purple, right? So there are different kind of easy tweaks you can do on your board. You can also divide your board, the stages, but also you can divide your board in doing, done, right? it's kind of a little bit the same as the tag, but the tag can be used. The tag will be used everywhere, right? So if you use that user story in queries, in other boards, the tags will help you filter it. The doing done, it's only on that board that is appearing. So it's a little bit more tricky to kind of, you cannot change it effectively. You just have to drag and drop it to change it. So that's why you kind of tags, it's more, it's easier to use effectively. So once you're here, you can kind of, tweak your board where, you can show fields. You can also add your style. So as I showed you the blocked ones, the card colors is pink. You can change the title style, but it's when the flag is contains blocked, you color that user story in pink, right? And then it appears like that. You can also, let me go back quickly. You can also, define colors for tags, right? So the block one is red, the ready for test is green, and so forth. So you can kind of pretty much configure and customize a bit this board here to meet your need. Oh yeah, the doing done, let me show you quickly as well this one. So what you have is, the columns. You can define the columns, but in analysis, I can go and I can say split column into doing and done, right? So easily done. You can add even swim lanes. I don't often use that, but you can add swim lanes to define maybe if release 1 or release 2, and then kind of order your stories that way. There's a few settings you can play with. So that's really all your user stories that you can see. Now the other one I wanted to show you, I showed you the backlog as well. The other one I can show you the sprints, right? So the sprint is where you will see your tasks. So if I go to my second sprint, if we have planned, those 2 user stories to be delivering iteration 2, there is a field on each of the user story. Then you will see the tasks and the bugs showing up, in that sprint board. And then you can manage the allocation of tasks to your team. You can manage the allocation of bugs to your team. So you can, if you can assign that task to someone and then move that task to active. You can play with the hours as well. I've used it a few times on some projects, not all of them. You can say a task takes 8 hours, and then you have a capacity of your team. I didn't set capacity here, but your team, for example, has a capacity of, you have 3 developers, they have a capacity together of so 24 hours a day, so 3 days, sorry, 3 days, and then the sprint is 2 weeks. So you have a certain capacity, and you can kind of fit as many tasks as you have capacity in it, right? So you can also use it that way. And you can also play with the coloring on that board, right? You can use a completely different set of coloring if you wanted to, right? So, but same as the other one, you go here and you play with fields and styles. All right, so that's for the demo. And then, just before closing off, I'll just share a few more tips with you just for the end. So what I often use is logical ID to refer to epics. So I'm not sure if you have seen, but epic 1, epic 2, epic 3, I named it with numbers so that I can refer, we are 70% close to finishing epic 1 instead of giving the whole name of the epic. It's kind of easier for me to identify and talk about numbers. Yeah, you can add custom fields to your epic and features and even user stories, right? So what I've showed you a bit before, maybe you have seen it. So I've added that document field that has a hyperlink. Sometimes we use external IDs when, the client has an Excel spreadsheet and they manage, those original ID there. We can use them and add them in Azure DevOps. Definition of ready. So when you move from from analysis to dev, it's often a good idea to understand what do you want to have. For me, often it's acceptance criteria validated and agreed on. I've shown a prototype. There is kind of that shared understanding. So there's a few list of items that I want to tick off before I can move my story from in analysis to dev. And so if you want to take a look, so I have a few articles regarding Azure DevOps, managing Azure DevOps, but also the value stream mapping to kind of capture requirements. If you are more interested, you can take a look at my website, danikahil.com. For more articles if you are interested. And that's for the presentation. Again, thank you very much. And again, any questions, continue to put your question in the chat. I'll be responding to them just now. So thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for your time and your great questions, actually, all over. So, look, I responded to a few of them while we were live, and I reserved a few of the good ones, or the ones I couldn't be responding in the chat for the end. So I'll just repeat. Scott Jackson, you had a good question about for detailed user stories that are more complex, to define with kind of rich text definition, and so forth. You kind of find DevOps a bit limiting in terms of copying and pasting, the definitions in DevOps. So basically, look, what I often do, and I covered slightly in my session, is I try not to document too much in Azure DevOps under the user stories. So I have my user stories with a description. I have a few bullet points for the acceptance criteria underneath. And then any complex rule that requires formatting, where tables are required, where you need to, map fields or specific business rules that are being mapped, I store them in specific SharePoint or SharePoint locations, basically, that are accessible via SharePoint or team sites. And then I have in my user stories, I have a custom field that points to that folder in SharePoint, and I store all the extra rules and kind of mapping tables and rich formatting. If you have some requirements that require rich formatting, I store them there. Um, for the reason that you mentioned, copying and pasting those big tables, for me, it's not super convenient. And also, I don't really like using the attach button in under the story, because you cannot really easily edit, you cannot really easy edit your tables, your document. You have to download the documents, edit them, and then re-upload them. And yeah, it's not so user friendly, if that makes sense. So I have actually customized the user story templates, because you can have as many fields as you want. You can kind of customize a bit the templates for the forms, and then effectively you can then add your fields. And I actually, there was a question about integration and Power Automate and so forth. So I actually used Power Automate to integrate with SharePoint. So whenever I create a story in Azure DevOps, I have automatically a folder being created in SharePoint, and then the location of that folder is being copied into that field in Azure DevOps. So that, I have that automation sorted out. I can click on that field from DevOps, that will open the SharePoint folder, and I can copy those extra documentation if required. Yeah, some of the other questions I had. So quality checks, yeah, so I usually use, if you meant quality checks about user stories, I think so. What I understood from the question is the what I call acceptance criteria. So effectively, look, as I said during the presentation, I try not to have over complex acceptance criteria in the user story as well. If it becomes really almost a specification document, it means that the user story is probably too big, and I then try to split that user story in smaller stories. So yeah, this is how I manage the quality checks, if that makes sense. There is also, because I track my bug, or we track the bugs under each story. So a story is being delivered, and then when we create bugs, we link them to the story. So bugs are also associated with, they relate to test cases. So it's a nice way where you can actually link all those items together, right? You deliver your story into dev, you have a tester that wrote the test cases based on your acceptance criteria, and then they raise bugs. Bugs are linked to the user story. They can be assigned to a team member. You can track them on a board.
Same as task, you can track tasks as well under your user story, so you can assign specific tags to your users. So if, for example, if I have a user story, I don't know, let's take a user story to configure the scheduling board for field service, let's say. I might have a task for one of my dev to configure the filtering, configure the views and so forth. Maybe another developer might configure the queries, which are XML queries. So I can create those tasks related to the story and assign those tasks to my dev team or to myself as well. So it's kind of link them nicely all together. Let me see the other question. So Sarah is asking, can you invite a guest, a customer to view? So you can invite, oh, how was that working? So you have 5 licenses for free, 5 access for free, but I think, so in the past you could invite external user, but now I think they need to be invited via your Azure Active Directory. I think there is something else that needs to be done. If you want just to invite some external user, I think they need to be invited by kind of your Active Directory admin tenant. I would have to double check though, but I think there is definitely a way to invite external users. The other question I see, hi Dani, do you use delivery plan for managing? If yes, maybe chance to have any proven delivery plans. Oh, so I use delivery plans. I'm not sure about the 2.0 version. I've used delivery plans, and I thought that was the new version. I'm not sure if it's what you call the 2.0 version, but I've definitely used delivery plans where we track the features and we can set the dates. Um, yeah, if that might respond to the question. Do you have a formalized way of documenting technical solution system config related to user stories? Um, Not really a formalized way of documenting solution. Look, usually documentation comes as we go through the build. Was what we do is we build an as-built document, right? With kind of rules. It often comes a bit later because once we are in the pure kind of dev, we documented too much at the beginning would be time consuming because in agile you change things kind of quite often, especially in the kind of beginning and middle of the project. So we kind of tend to document when the config is a bit more stable. So we build an as-built documents that we usually, actually it's not really a document anymore. Most of my documentation, I build them in a wiki, in Azure DevOps or in Teams. So you have both. It's kind of a preference, whatever preference the clients wanted. I've built most of my wikis I've actually built in Teams. So there is a wiki tab where you can structure, your tabs and your documentation. I've also seen some people building the wikis in Azure DevOps as well. And you can also, if you build your documentation in the wiki in DevOps, you can also link items using the hashtag as well. I've never really used it that much. I mostly use Teams, but I know some people have used DevOps wiki as well. Um, Let me see what else is there. How can you create a rule that only certain teams members can move items into certain columns? Analyst would only be able to move. Oh, I'm not sure actually, Scott. By role, I'm not sure you can. I'm not sure. I haven't done that. I've done, as I said, the rule where you can move things based on field values. So I've set in the past so rules where you cannot move a user story from a certain state to another without the acceptance criteria filled in. But not by user. I'm not sure you can actually. Uh, Look, the security in DevOps, it's not very granular, to be fair. I find that sometimes very easy. You need to assign kind of a higher role to someone simply because they will be limited. So we have been, for example, giving the highest role because someone couldn't work with, I think they couldn't save their own queries. That required already the biggest level of authority. So there is not many granularities from what I've seen and played with in Azure DevOps. Now, look, I'm not an expert in Azure DevOps itself, the tool. I'm kind of I'm trying to take best practices in Dynamics, but there is really it's another platform, right? That comes with plenty of new features. Um, Look, I'm getting the signal that I'll have to wrap up soon. Thank you all for your question. Thank you, DynamicsCon. And yeah, with me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to take on some more questions and take the conversation there. All right, see you guys all, and enjoy DynamicsCon again. And good evening, good morning, bye.